This will be a start to finish detail strip of a Colt 1911. This particular pistol is a 1929 commercial model. First thing we need to do before we do any work, we need to verify that the gun is unloaded and empty. So we're going to verify that there's no magazine inserted in the gun. Then we're going to do a visual check of the chamber area. Do that, pull the slide to the rear, visually check that there's not a round in there, check that no magazine is in there, let the slide forward, and to start with, I like to put the thumb safety on. The first step for me is to remove the guide rod plug to start the process. So to do that, rotate the gun so the muzzle's pointing to the sky. We'll take our thumb and depress the guide rod plug, and we'll rotate the bushing clockwise if you're looking at the muzzle to get it out of the way of the guide rod plug. Remember to keep tension on that guide rod plug so it doesn't go flying all over the place. Slowly release the tension. That'll allow us to remove the guide rod plug. Now the next step that we'll do is to remove the slide from the frame. To do that, we make sure the bushing is rotated all the way clockwise, and we put the thumb safety in the off position, move the slide to the rear until the assembly notch or the disassembly notch is in line with the rear of the slide stop. And to remove the slide stop, rotate the gun, push lightly from the right hand side of the gun, and you'll notice that the slide stop comes partially out on the left hand side. To get it the rest of the way, we'll pull the slide stop out from the left hand side and get it out of the way. Now the slide can be removed from the frame. To do that, just push the slide forward off the frame. We'll set the frame aside for now and continue with disassembling the slide. Next thing to do is remove the guide rod and the recoil spring. Do that, just comes out towards the rear. The guide rod can then be separated from the spring. We'll set those aside. Next thing to remove is the bushing. Previously we rotated that bushing clockwise to remove the guide rod plug. Now we will rotate that bushing counterclockwise until the notch on the inside of the bushing lines up with the tunnel, approximately that position, and then we should be able to pull the bushing out from the front. Now remember, some guns are going to have a tight bushing. You may need to use a bushing wrench and a little force to get that out. Next thing we're going to do is remove the slide, or remove the barrel from the slide. To do that, we're going to rotate the link to the forward position. We're going to push up or push the barrel down and remove it from the front of the slide. Now this is the configuration. Basically the pistol is field stripped this. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is finish disassembly of the slide. Now to do that, I like to use a little punch, and we'll be removing the firing pin stop, the firing pin spring, and the extractor. Remember that when we remove this firing pin stop, the spring and the firing pin spring, it's under tension there. It's going to want to shoot out kind of like the guide rod plug does. So we need to make sure that we're capturing that so it doesn't go flying all over the room. Now the way I do this is I take a punch and I depress the firing pin spring, and I rotate that punch slightly just to move the firing pin stop down slightly. And that allows me to now set up to capture the firing pin and the firing pin spring so they don't go all over the place. And to do that, I take my thumb and I put my thumb in this orientation, so when I remove that firing pin stop, the firing pin spring don't have anywhere to go except against my thumb. Now to get that firing pin stop out, keep your thumb in position, put your punch down in that hole, slowly moving the firing pin stop down. When it gets far enough down that you can get a hold of it with your fingers, if it's not too tight, go ahead and pull it out. And that noise you heard was the firing pin spring bouncing up against my thumb. So now we can remove firing pin spring. and they're just separated like that. Now we're going to need to remove the extractor, and to really get the extractor out, you can do one of two things. You can use a non-marring tool such as this from 10-8 Performance and pry in the groove there. This one's a little bit tight, so we'll give it a little push from the front, and then we should be able to get it out from the rear. So to do that, you need to get into the breech area here, the breech face area, and push on the front of that extractor to get it loose back there. And to do that, I just use this same punch and very lightly taking care not to mar any of the surfaces there. Get that punch on the front of the extractor. Now we've pushed that extractor back very slightly. As you can see now, the extractor is sticking up back here, and we should be able to remove it with this non-marring tool now. So now we've got it far enough out we can get our fingers on it. We go ahead and pull the extractor out. Now that's the complete disassembly of the slide, with exception of the sights, and that's more than this video needs to cover. So the slide is now bare. We have our series of parts. We have slide stop, extractor, bushing, guide rod plug, slide stop, guide rod, barrel with the link still attached, firing pin spring, and our recoil spring. Now, put this back together is exactly the opposite. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take the extractor, and remember the extractor, when it sits in the slide, it sits in that orientation. And when it's in that orientation, what holds it at the rear from moving front to back is the slide stop. So this is the orientation that the extractor sits if the slide is in this orientation, and this firing pin stop sits in that groove in the extractor. So when we put this extractor in the back of the slide, we need to make sure that it's not tilted this way or this way, and it's not too far forward or too far back, or the slide stop won't be able to fit up in there, and we'll have all kinds of trouble getting it back together. So take your extractor, and this is going to vary depending on the type of the gun, the extractor tension you have, may be harder or easier to go back in the slide. We're going to insert it into the slide there, and you notice that it's on a little bit of an angle like that, so you have to give it a little bit of a push that way to get it completely back in the slide. So we're going to give it a little bit of a push, and now it's in there, and we're going to push it forward, and you can usually hear it get close in there. Now what we want to do is we want to inspect this slot right here. Remember, that's where the firing pin stop slides down in there and holds the extractor. And so what I usually do before I get to wrestling with the firing pin and the firing pin spring is I'll make sure that firing pin stop goes into that groove completely, and it's flush at the bottom like it should be, and then that'll make sure that it's all set up to accept the firing pin and the spring. So we take firing pin stop, insert it. Remember, this radius here is going to be facing towards the bottom of the slide, and this rounded area is going to be towards the top of the slide. So take that firing pin stop and push it all the way in, make sure it goes up in there nice and easily. Now, there's no need to completely remove that firing pin stop now that we have it in there. We know that everything is going to go together. So what I do, again, I bring that firing pin stop down till it's about there. Okay. Now, when you put the firing pin and the firing pin spring back together, there's usually on the firing pin spring, one end is smaller than the other. So if we put it on this way, it just goes on and comes off, and that firing pin spring is not retained on the firing pin. That's not what we want it, how we want it to go back together. We want the closed end to be on the firing pin spring. Now those two are pretty well locked together. This is an old firing pin spring, but regardless, they're locked together, as you can see, and it takes a little bit of force to get them apart. That's the way we want it to go back together. And we push that firing pin spring on there completely. Now, again, just like taking this apart, we're going to have to compress this spring a little bit to get that firing pin stop up completely. Now, it's not a problem. There's a real easy way to do it, just a real simple way. So we're going to we have the firing pin stop installed, we have the extractor installed, and we're going to drop the firing pin spring down in there at the same time. Now, this can be complicated slightly if your firing pin stop is very tight, but regardless, the same application or the same techniques apply. What I like to do again is remember that we're going to compress this firing pin spring, and it could shoot out. So again, I like to keep my thumb around there, and I take my finger, put my finger on the bottom of the firing pin stop, okay? And as I'm compressing the firing pin spring, keeping my thumb up there in case it slips out, I'm going to push with my finger. Hopefully you can see that. I'm going to push with my finger, and that's going to capture the firing pin spring. Again, what we're going to do here is we're going to compress the firing pin. Now I'm going to get my thumb out of the way so you can see, but we're going to compress the firing pin spring. And with our index finger here, we're going to push that firing pin stop up until it captures the firing pin spring, and we're going to completely push the firing pin stop up until the firing pin slips back through there. Now, one check once you have it to this point is you want to verify that that firing pin is moving freely in there. Should feel a spring tension, but that needs to be captured in there and needs to move freely. Now, to put the rest of it back together, we'll wait until we do the final assembly.